Hello, Steel City Surge fans. Skippy here, coach of the Steel City Surge, back for another quick little draft analysis. This is going to be for the Nova Bacon Battalion League, or otherwise known as NBBL. This is going to be season 5. This was an absolutely crazy draft, and um, we'll get into a little bit about that. So, essentially, with this draft, this is more of like an Uber's mixed draft league where a couple of normally banned Ubers mons are mixed into regular mons. And the way this draft is set up is not necessarily points based, it's more tier based. So the way that we were drafting was we got one tier one, two tier twos, two tier threes, and then three tier fours and three tier fives, with Terra captains being set for one from each tier of tier three, four, and five. You get one stab type and two alternate types that don't need to be stabbed but can be stabbed if you're dual typing. And yeah, there are a couple. There was probably 8 or 9 or so typically banned mons that were allowed during this. And unfortunately, the ones that I was looking at, I didn't really end up getting. So the way that the draft worked for this for our draft order, Nova decided to do a Smash Duos tournament, and all things said and done, we ended up getting 11th, which appears to be like the most consistent spot that I end up drafting in is like 11th or 12th, which is very funny. But the weird thing about this was it wasn't just like a typical 14 to 16 person draft. No, this was 28 people. We had 28 people drafting for Paldea decks with a couple of Ubers for an entire draft. It was insanity. There was snipes every single pick, every single round. It was absolutely insane. And you'll see here, we don't technically have like a broken Ubermon. Partly because there was like two or three that fell to me, and I was looking at them. I'm like, these guys don't really stand out to me. I don't really think they can do that much for me. And I ended up picking up the first Terra captain of the draft for everyone. That was not a tier one. So I went with tier 3 first, and we got Terra Necrozma. Terra Necrozma is just an absolute monster. Prism Armor is such a great ability for it, and it can run so many different sets. I mean, it gets Dragon Dance for speed control, so it can boost its speed. It gets a variety of coverage moves, so it doesn't necessarily need to run Terra all that much, but running Terra on it just makes it so much better. It got insane bulk with really good attacking stats. It's got a decent enough speed tier that we can take use of Dragon Dance or just Trick Room if we really wanted to. And we're running on a Terra Psychic, Fairy, and Dark. Psychic and Fairy are typically like normal. I want to say normal. Uh, overall like Terra types for Necrozma. Um, then we're running Dark because I feel like that's going to take advantage of the rest of the team, and we'll get into the rest of the picks here in a second. So we're running Psychic, Fairy, and Dark for our Terra types in Necrozma. Now, getting into our second pick, it technically wasn't Sneasler. It was technically Quaquaval, because I wanted a fighting type to pair with Necrozma. And around halfway through the draft or so, the person who ended up drafting Sneasler, I believe it was Erika, said, "Hey, does anyone want Sneasler? I'm not feeling the vibe with this. I want my boy Chiyu." We snagged that so quick. Uh, so we ended up making a trade. We ended up trading Quackwavel, and we picked up Chiyu as well. We'll get into the pick that we traded Quackwavel for in a second, but we ended up swapping Chiyu for Sneasler, which I think pairs insanely well with Necrozma because it's got a great speed tier at 120. Combine that with its Unburden ability, and it's just offensive output of Poison Touch and its insanely good physical attacking stat. This thing gets a lot of different coverage moves, which is awesome. It gets fast U-turn, pivot. Poison touch is just a great ability. Acrobatics with Unburden is insane. And it really breaks down the dark types for Necrozma if it doesn't want to run Terra Fairy or if it just doesn't want to sit in on dark types. So it's a very good way to break steals as well, so we don't need to run Earth Power. We don't need to run Terra Fire, which we didn't end up running. Stuff like that. And then poison types help deal with fairies too, which is a really good thing because Necrozma doesn't technically want to deal with fairies all that much, even though it does get like Flash Cannon and Iron Head. It doesn't really want to take up a move slot for that, so for coverage purposes. So having Sneasler there is really good. Plus, fast physical wall breaker pairs well with the bulky special attacker and setup sweeper in Necrozma. So very good role player there. Our next pick was originally was Clodsire because we didn't have a poison type or a grounded poison type when going through the draft selections. And typically having 2 grounded poison types is not exactly the best move in my opinion, because it doubles up on a couple of weaknesses. But I think we cover that pretty well throughout the rest of our draft. Clodsire is just really good because it gets Unaware, it gets Water Absorb, it also gets Poison Point if we really want to run that. It also gets really good support moves, specifically Haze. Haze is really good for us, especially with Unaware. Counter, Curse. It gets a lot of, it gets Spikes, Stealth Rocks, Toxic Spikes. It gets all the hazards. It's a really good hazard setter. It's really bulky and tanky. And can put out some pretty good damage with a decent enough attack stat of 75. So it can still do some damage, but it's mainly there for defensive core. And that kind of brings us to our next pick. We originally had Quaquaval here as our tier 2, and then we swapped it for Corviknight. So going from Chiyu and Quaquaval to Sneasler and Corviknight, I think is really good because Corviknight is a really good slow defensive pivot, and it's a steel type. It gets defog. It's probably one of the best defoggers in the game outside of Mandibuzz. And it's just really tanky. Its body press is really good for it. I mean, it's got a 105 defense. Iron defense is really good for it as well. It gets a nerve and mirror armor, which is pretty good abilities. Even pressure is good for stalling out if we really wanted to do that. It gets access to screens, roost for recovery, taunt, like I said before, U-turn. So it just adds to our defensive core with Clodsire, and I think it's a really good. These two are really good pairing together. But there is like 1 or 2 different types, like fire, for instance. We don't really have a resistance to fire, which brings me to my next selection, which I wanted to round out the defensive core with Rotom Wash. I've used Rotom Wash before, but it was more of an offensive output mon, and I feel like with the team that we have currently, it's going to be more of like a defensive, bulky pivot, potential Scarfer every so often, maybe a nasty plot setup, but mainly there for screens usage, mainly there to get some Will-O-Wisp off, Trick, Volt Switch, Thunderwave, all that fun stuff. Just be there as like a bulky support mon to round out that defensive core with Clodsire and Corviknight. I think it really kind of meshes well with the other two. They cover the majority of types, giving me at least a 1 resistance per type, with the exception of like Dark and Ghost. And we kind of cover that throughout the rest of the draft too. And we don't really need to worry about that too much because Necrozma's ability, Prism Armor, just kind of makes that not super effective and not super worrisome. Obviously, there's going to be some caveats to that, but I think we cover it pretty well with the rest of our draft. Our next pick ended up being Dachshund because by this point, with 28 people in the draft, you're going to run out of fairies really, really quick. And Dachshund was a tier 5, so not the worst selection, especially for a fairy type. And it's got a really good ability, so it gives me another fire resistance and technically immunity. It gives me it gives me a defense boost with fire type moves whenever they make contact with Dachshund. So that's really good for body press builds for this thing. It's really defensive. It can be offensive as well if we really wanted to. It can run Wish. Endeavor is a pretty fun move to use on it, but mainly this is just going to be like a defensive fairy type that comes in every so often to certain matchups depending on the need, and it's just there for support purposes and defense purposes. So nothing really too fancy about it, but I did really want a fairy type to try to round out the roster a little bit. Now, this next pick is like the first true snipe that I was really mad about. I was originally looking at Goodra for a Bolt Beam Mon, because Goodra gets both Ice Beam and Thunderbolt. And I was looking at that, and it went right before the turn going into the next round for this pick. And I was thinking to myself, crap, all right, let me look at and see what's available here. And I came across Jolteon, and Jolteon's typically a very good secondary Terra Captain. It can be a good primary Terra Captain, but it really only wants to run like 1 or 2 types outside of its electric typing. That being like ice and grass and fairy potentially. And I was looking at this, I'm like, this already has the Bolt side of Bolt Beam. If I run Terra Ice, I can run Bolt Beam if I really need it. And am I going to be running Bolt Beam a lot? Probably not, especially with Necrozma being an option for Terra. So this thing is going to be a backup Terra Captain mainly. with access to a Terra Electric, Ice, and Fairy. Fairy is there for Alluring Voice, so we can get an offensive Fairy type Mon. Obviously, Dashman is not going to be that offensive, and it's probably not going to be running specially offensive all that often. So, um, having that option with Jolteon and not only Jolteon but Necrozma too is pretty nice. And it's just going to be something that's going to be more speed control. So we don't need to run Unburdened Sneasler all the time in order to get certain speed. And it gets me a better electric type Mon outside of Rotom Wash. So that way Rotom Wash can focus on being more bulky as opposed to being offensive, which I think works out pretty well, especially because Rotom is Levitate for its abilities. So that also really helps a ton. And going into the next round, we still had a tier 2 left, and looking at the tier 2s, nothing really stood out to me, but Ogerpon is something that's always intrigued me. I've used Hearthflame a couple of times before. It's never really stood out to me, partly because its item has to be one of the masks. And I like the idea of base Ogerpon. Defiance, really good ability. Anytime we lose a stat, anytime a stat drop occurs, we gain 2 to our attack stat, which is already pretty high at 120. And it's a solid speed tier at 110 as well, so that covers another speed tier check. And we get access to knockoff, U-turns, spikes, spiky shield for potential stall purposes, taunt. We get Encore, which has been a very fun move for me in the past. Ivy Cudgel obviously is stab and is a high crit rate and all that stuff. Horn Leech, Brick Break, all that fun stuff. It's a very fun mon and very interesting. I've never gotten the hang of Ogerpon Hearthflame, but base Ogerpon with the option of having an item for it is going to be pretty nice to see what we can do with it. I'm very interested to see what happens with that. And then next up came a controversial kind of pick. So I was looking for hazard removal to pair with Corviknight, so we didn't have to run Corviknight every week. And I was looking at Avalugg and during the draft, a couple of people were looking to have picks held, and I was like, all right, you know what? Fine. I have the opportunity to hold picks. I'm going to go ahead and hold some picks. That was a mistake because I found out so many people wanted Avalugg. So I ended up going with Colossal, which I think is actually a better option for us because not only is it a rapid spinner, but he also gets access to Stealth Rock and Spikes. He also has a pretty good move pool across the board. He has some really good abilities too with Steam Engine, so we can get max speed being hit by a fire or water type. And Flame Body, which is always really, really nice to get burn on contact. And then Flash Fire as well for a fire immunity, which is honestly kind of nice. But the other thing is we're running Colossal as our tier 5 Terra Captain. We're going to be running Fire, Grass, and Water with this guy, so that way we can make the most out of Steam Engine, Flash Fire, and Flame Body. And he's going to be like the potential secondary Terra Captain in any matchup. Kind of like Jolteon, probably not going to run it quite as much, but it would be a very nice defensive option if we know Necrozma is not going to be able to set up or not going to be able to sweep late game or clean or anything like that with a Terra. So it's a nice option that can come pretty much any week into any given matchup and do some damage because it gets access to some pretty good moves across the board. So it's also very bulky, so we can run it as like a setup option potentially. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of setup that we can run with this guy, but Curse is always an option. So physically offensive is a pretty decent option. Same with Iron Defense. It does get access to Body Press, so that could be pretty fun to use. But yeah, going into the last couple of picks, I still had a tier 5 and a tier 4 open, obviously, and I ended up going with Indeedee for my tier 5 pick because I'll be honest, Sneasler is really good with Unburden when it can get off its Unburden without having to use a move. A lot of that comes with terrain usage. Rillaboom was already long gone, like early round 2, I think is when it went. So that kind of eliminated that option. I didn't want to use my tier 4 for that pick as well for Thwackey, because I wanted to use it for a dark type, and we'll get into that dark type in a minute. You can already see it on the screen. But looking at Indeedee, Psychic Terrain with Psychic Surge, this allows for the Psychic Seed to pop for Sneasler. Not only that, it prevents all priority, so I don't need to worry about priority moves like Sucker Punch hitting me, which is a really good combination for Sneasler because with Unburden, you're like the fastest thing alive. Like, you're faster than Regieleki, which is really, really good. for a very fast and physical mon. So I can run like an Adamant Nature with Unburden and hit really, really high speeds and outspeed everything on the field. So Psychic Surge pairs really, really well with that. Um, I get both forms of Ndidi with this too, so I can run the offensive Ndidi or the defensive Ndidi and get access to like Expanding Force, or I can get access to Healing Wish. I get access to Healing Wish either way, but you get the gist. So both options are very, very good. I still get access to Trick Room, which is nice because I don't need to run Trick Room on Necrozma if I want to run it. I can run it on Ndidi. This is going to be more of a niche support option potentially for certain matchups, but I think it's going to be a really nice tier 5 option to pair with Sneasler, to pair with Necrozma if we do get some speed boosted up there, so we don't get hit by priority or whatever. And then our last pick ended up being Zoroark to complete the Fighting, Dark, and Psychic core. This thing, I think, is going to do very, very well for us because it pairs well with Sneasler again, just because it can come in posing as Sneasler and bait out a Psychic type attack that it's immune to, and then hit really hard or set up on whatever is in front of it. It also gets knockoff, which is stab, which is really, really nice, even though it probably wants to run special more often than not. It also gets access to like U-turn and trick, which is also really, really good. It gets a really nice move pool, very diverse, very useful. Gets some really nice moves, pretty supportive, pretty offensive. You can really run it either way. And it's just a really bothersome mon to try to prep for and play against because you never know when it's going to come in until it starts taking some damage. So it's something that everyone's going to have to really think about and prep for. It's like Ditto almost with that illusion ability. So that way, whatever the last Pokemon in the party is, it's going to take that form. So it's going to really force some mind games out for my opponent if I end up bringing it that week. So I thought it was a very nice mon. I've never gotten to use any of the Zoroarks. I never thought they fit on any of my teams. So having this option right now is pretty nice. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do with these guys. All across the board, I think this is a very fun draft. All in all, we're only in a pool of 14 coaches now for the regular season, but 28 person draft, man. Nova, you kill me sometimes, man. Jeez. Thank you so much to Nova for offering or inviting me into this league. I'm very much looking forward to using this. I've never gotten the chance to use Terra Necrozma before, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what we can do with it. Same with Sneasler. Pretty much all the mons outside of like Rotom Wash, I've never really used before or thought about using before. So I'm really interested to seeing how we can do with this. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check back for week 1. We'll post that next week. We'll be posting weekly uploads for this league. I'll be doing everything myself just because, I don't know, it's just a fun league. So it's going to be a little different than PDL. PDL is more professional, but this is going to be a very fun league that we take part in. Thank you again, Nova, and I'll see you guys next week for week 1. Peace.